So next is Orta Therox, and he's gonna tell us a story about how he convinced all his company to open source all of their iOS applications. It's all yours.
All right. Ha there we go. Fabulous. Okay, so you got the spoiler. I will be talking about open source by default. So my name is Orta Therox. I've been doing Cocoa now for over a decade. For the last 4 years, I've been working at a company called Artsy. We're a company that is now for iOS programmers doing 4 apps. So lots of 4s. Whoa, I managed to reset this somehow. So, Artsy. We're a startup that aims to bring the entire of the art world online. By doing this, we want to basically lower the barrier of entry for people to start appreciating art and make it as nice and easy as something like Apple Music or Spotify. It's a nice, simple idea. We do this via a project called the Human Genome Project. And this is interesting because the Human Genome Project is this human-curated connections between artworks. And it's one of these problems where it's very easy to think up front that maybe we could create this fancy algorithm to connect artworks. But the way Artsy chose to do it was that we would have humans involved in the process as much as possible, because they are the domain experts in art. And one of our core values here is art meets science. So again, there is an idea that we could have started to try and do all of this artwork connections algorithmically, but instead we chose for a more human approach. So as an individual, I'm mostly known for my open source work. This is either working on CocoaPods, which is one of the many dependency managers for Cocoa. It is. There's at least 5 that I can name right now. And when I started working on it, I saw quite a big flaw in the way that we were doing documentation. As Justin said earlier, every major open source project has documentation problems. And I came into it and never strictly worked on the project. I came in and only worked on things that surrounded it. I built the websites, I built the documentation, the guides, all of these things that not necessarily the way that you would typically attack a problem of how do I contribute to open source. The thing that I'm most proud of is the CocoaPods brand, and that's not even something most people even think about when they're trying to take an open source project and contribute to it. And part of this again comes back to the way in which we reflect where I work on how we should be contributing our time. It's very easy to sit there and think to myself, well, I could easily ship a feature for Artsy, but I could also start shipping features that affect every single one of you. And part of the process of us getting towards open source by default was changing our mindset from always thinking about how can we make an impact for ourselves to how can we make an impact to ourselves and to the rest of the community. So my colleague, Ash Thoreau, you may have just seen him, had this quote at his last talk, which was, "Those who do not study history cannot make informed decisions about the present." That's about right? He's nodding. It's good. And from my perspective, one of the oldest concepts of computer philosophy and science is that you should be sharing as much as possible. So it used to be that in the 60s and the 70s, you would just get the source code for your operating system, for your computer, and you could make the changes and you could do whatever. And as we got more and more complicated software, it became less feasible to be able to do that. It also became commercially viable to sell software and not just hardware tied to software. And at Artsy, we're trying to bring this concept back. Open source by default is a mindset that we have been slowly moving towards, and it is not an instant thing that we could just instantly do. It has taken time and process, and for me, it's taken maybe 2 years of like active work outside of my code to actively get to a point where the company has no problem with us shipping every single piece of code that we ever write as open source. So from my perspective, I think I was just the right person at the right time. When I was 16, my parents took me off to some foreign country, and I snuck off and got a tattoo that said /free. And it's been this, yeah, I know. The font is pretty terrible from my perspective now, you know, strong opinions, weakly held, and maybe Geneva wasn't the right choice, but I don't know if it gets shipped with the operating system anymore. But I ended up working at a company where I was given the space to actively contribute back to the community in my own time. So initially, this worked by me trying to improve documentation in every single library. There was a fault in that everyone that wanted to provide documentation for any of their libraries would have to create their own documentation, which I've used that word far too many times, and then upload it to their own server, maybe put it on a GitHub pages, and it was a very easy problem to start attacking. I just felt I could do this easily, but the hard bit was actually trying to get it polished. And during this time, I shipped multiple apps at where I work, but I would also spend a large amount of time actively working on this project called CocoaDocs whilst I was still trying to ship apps. And it's easy to think that I, as an individual, spent a lot of time actively working on this project, but being able to persuade the people above me was super valuable in actively being able to then work on things that were for the community instead of just for myself and for the rest of Artsy as a whole. One of the interesting things where I work is that maybe the team that you know, the mobile team, which is 4 people in a company of 140 people, we've managed to get to a point where we do open source by default, wherein every single app we ship is totally available for anybody to see. Not only that, all of our pull requests, all of our issues, all of our like features coming up are all available for anyone to actively go in and look. And this is an interesting process in itself because sometimes you'd want to have a surprise. You'd like to save ideas for a release, and some of the ways in which we work around this are kind of interesting, and if it's something that people want, we can talk about that as a question at the end. But I've talked quite a lot recently on our blog about like the raw implementations of how we would actively persuade people within the company that it was valuable to us when we tried to think about our core values. I know, how dare she talk during my talk? And how we can take some of these ideas that developers think are important, like the open source world and contributing back to communities, and actively persuade the people whose job it is to make sure that we're shipping things on time, and to take that and make it say, this actually reflects the values that we want to reflect. Because I like to think most companies have core company values. For ours, that is like openness, transparency, I think it's love. And then, I know, we're like way out there. It's beautiful. And then there's one more around, quality worthy of art. And part of that is interesting because the ways in which I pitch this usually is that we are trying to lower the barrier to entry for anybody else to start contributing both in the community and to become a developer themselves. When I started learning 10 years ago, there was no like hackathon kind of places to go and ask people, you know, how does this work? There was no Stack Overflow. There was no, I'm going into a Slack chat room to go and ask, how does this work? I ended up consulting the source code for Adium and Colloquy like daily. This was the way in which I studied and the way in which I learned and the way in which I managed to get myself from basically from informed programmer to starting to hit expert. Ash talked earlier about the, what was it? You had the beginner, then you had the experience. advanced beginner. Like, these are stages that most people don't necessarily try to target in things like blog posts, because by the time you're writing and confident in your blog posts, you are usually starting to hit somewhere around expert, or you're right at the beginning of beginner. Providing source code and providing process is a really interesting way of allowing other people to understand how you can get from stage X to stage Y. And as an individual, I struggled a lot with trying to figure out how could I get from being someone who has completed a book to someone who can not just ship an app, but ship something complex and something with lots of interlocking parts. And the only way that I could do that at the time was to consult other apps. So open sourcing your apps, from my perspective, makes that much easier. It wasn't a simple start. We didn't just actively take one of our applications and say, we should make this open. We felt that we needed to build tooling. We felt that we needed to understand the process. And so the way that we did it was that we pitched that the next app that we build should be open source. And that was a much easier sell. We said we were planning on building a new app anyway. We're going to try and do this from the beginning. It's an experiment. If it doesn't work, then it's only like a small app in comparison to some of the other ones. The experiment worked. We had to build a bunch of new tooling that is now solid and mature. And by doing that process, we managed to start persuading the higher ups within the company that there is value in the way that we are shipping our source code to people, as well as being able to ship the process. Because it's easy to think that just the source code is out there, but the source code is only one part of the actual app itself. If you think about how we get hired, we are hired not for our ability to bring a code base with us, but we're hired on our ability to make change to a code base. And the changes are in part what makes you the programmer on a project. You are the one that is enabling new features, bug fixes, and it is your job as a programmer to do these kind of things. By open sourcing the process, you are showing people how it works at the highest levels. And that is something that is super, super valuable to the rest of both the community and people getting started. On top of that, it's also easy to think that maybe we're just going to ship a version of our app that is non-compilable or is crippled. And we experimented a bunch of ways of trying to find the right balance between this. So now we have like unit tests in some of our projects that check that both the open source version will actually include a stub database for some core data applications, whereas on the private Artsy version, which is only private in the sense that we have an environment variable in our computers, it will do a completely different action in terms of when you first run. So making it easy for people to actively download, compile, make, and change is not actively something that you have to do, but it's something that we felt was super important to our process of trying to open source our applications. Because it's easy to just ship some code, but it's much, much more useful to everyone else to be able to compile it themselves. Over where I live at the moment in New York City, we work with, I guess Artsy works with a charity called Coalition for Queens. This is a charity that tries to get disadvantaged people and minorities into the tech community. And so what we do is we host meetings for them, we go and help them set up a schedule and try and understand what to do next. And part of the process, for me, that was really useful, was actively trying to get as many of them as possible compiling our applications on their own machines as soon as possible. Going through that process enabled them to start making pull requests to our applications, which is really useful, but not something that you should be thinking, this is why I'm going to open source something, because don't expect other people to start making changes to a commercial application. But it gave them this freedom and the ability to have gone from not programmer to 2 weeks into being a programmer and to have a fully running application that they can get out and put in their app store and see and feel and then make changes to themselves and say, like, I have actually made a change to a product, like a non-trivial app, is infinitely valuable both for them and for me as a person that wants to understand how do people learn to program. Because every time you are hiring a junior, you are teaching someone new to program in a way in which you as a team or individual actively promotes. So, I work on a pretty niche market. Like, the art world is obviously huge and massive and interesting, but the impact in which our app has doesn't necessarily conflate to how well people know us. We build a small app for anybody to explore the art world, but by making all of our things open source and by talking about it and by blogging about it and by, we wrote an Objective-C.io about it, we managed to make an impact with our application and our source code and our process more than we managed to make just by shipping the app. As a team and as an individual, I think it's very important, and I think open source enables us as programmers to be able to make a bigger impact than we could just by shipping an app. You can make a library like AF Networking or Llama Fire or one of these other things, but other ways of doing that, being able to show some of these complicated ideas that you've come to, being able to highlight some of the features that you've got and being able to show how it works. The moment that the 3D touch support came into our application, I showed it to a bunch of people who were all having problems trying to support it, and they could just compare exactly to our result. We spent the time, they don't have to spend the time. And like, these impacts get bigger and bigger and bigger as you start to do larger and larger projects. Like, my contributions to CocoaPods is almost, I can't even imagine how many apps are actively, well, we saw in the top 100, 30 are using it, which means there must be millions and millions of daily usages of like the code that is being generated by some of these projects. The impact that we have by actively being involved in open source is unbelievable. It's huge. It is literally unimaginable. And I think that's a bad use of the word literally too. One of the other cool things that, in my opinion, as someone who cares about politics and other things, is that being open forces you to not be bad. Maybe bad citizens. So a good example of this might be if you were open and you were making a pull request that said, we're now going to scan all of your contacts and we're going to upload them to our application server and we're just going to keep them there and then eventually generate profiles for them, ghost profiles. Like, having that there and having it in the open is something that engineers would be much less likely to say, yes, I will actively make these features. Things like Twitter, the Twitter app scanning every single bundle ID to see what apps you've got installed is a little bit icky. And if everybody could see who was directly responsible to that, people would say no. A brilliant example of this comes from the CEO of Volkswagen yesterday, where he, I know, right? Where he said specifically, the problems we are seeing come from rogue programmers. Rogue programmers. That means any of us that has been told by someone probably that you should ship this feature and that they're the ones that are getting, the blame for it at the end of the day because they had to implement it. Having that available there would show that maybe it wasn't these two rogue programmers, maybe it was the manager telling them this way, and you can get to see the actual chain that may have come to the conclusion of we should be shipping green on our unit tests, but red locally. Bunch of good testing frameworks for that too. So part of my pitch again towards open sourcing our apps locally within Artsy was that I don't necessarily feel like our apps are complicated. I don't necessarily feel like our apps are particularly unique. I think for most people what you are probably doing is taking JSON data, user input and parsing them together, presenting something unique, sure, but you're not solving the biggest problems in the world. And effectively, your app is this conduit for data, but your app is worthless as the code base. And a code base itself is something that is always evolving, and as I said earlier, your job as a programmer is to evolve a code base. The current code base as it is a static snapshot of the context in which your application lives, and as you evolve it, then it becomes more valuable. But you are building apps, you're not building code bases. The actual code itself is just a side product of you trying to actively build a product. In order to evolve it, it has to have work on it. And just shipping it out to everyone else to be able to show this is how it works is a pretty easy sell. So usually we had a problem-ish where we have free applications that were open sourced. Another one came out last week, but we've not been pushing it. That was 4 years old, had very, it predated Arc, and we eventually cleaned up the code base, but this was an app that had competitors, and it had serious competition. This is a app that has 4 or 5 people, other companies that have serious investor money in the millions, only competing with this one app. And this was the one that took me the longest while to persuade everyone that it was going to be valuable, both to the community and to the rest of the world, that we should open it still, regardless, in order to actively get to a point where all of our work is entirely in the open. The pitch turned out to be pretty easy, actually, in that, again, it was all about the idea of static code bases. Anytime a competitor decided to just outright try and clone one of our applications, it was probably significantly more effort for them to actively clone our API than clone the database in order to make it the same of how ours works as the same as how theirs works. There's a ton of work that's just involved in transforming it from our work to their work, that then all they're really going to do is get a static snapshot of where that app was the first time. They then have to actively keep copying it, keep updating it whenever we find bug fixes. Are they going to merge them in on their clone? No one would ever think to themselves, I am going to start a company and I'm going to start it by cloning your code base, and I'm going to start using it as much as possible and improving it and making it myself without ever sending it back upstream, to my knowledge. Unless this has happened in Linux or whatever, but in the iOS world it's not happened yet, and it's not happened to me, and we're doing all right still. I don't believe that source code is ever particularly elegant. I'm particularly bad at shipping perfectly polished code bases. And a lot of the resistance I've generally heard from people around shipping some of their libraries or shipping their apps has been around the idea that my code quality is not good enough. And to some extent, I don't think that matters. It's not always about teaching the best practices. It's about teaching a way in which you made a decision at a time. Being able to show people the process means that people can then understand exactly how you came to that decision. I've shipped bad code. I've shipped code without tests. But the pull request explains how and why and provides context that maybe when the next future developer comes along and says, this code is terrible, someone can point to them and say, well, it was done under these constraints, and that's totally valid at the time, and maybe we can just fix it in the future. So to take that further, I always consider open source by default to be a mindset, and it's something that we're working on, and it's the idea that it's we're taking our commitment to ourselves in building quality products, and we're trying to bring it out a bit further. We're trying to not only improve our own tooling, but we're trying to improve everybody's tooling. This could be working on Cocoaboards, that could be building Xcode plugins, that could be building gems to do annoying automation tasks, making it easier as an individual to keep shipping things and not caring so much about the rawest details about how this all works out. I prefer working for others to make improvements to theirs and then reusing their stuff. I've been finding lately that the AI industry I've been really worried about this lately. As more and more things get replaced by machines, it's kind of important, I think, that we try to keep remembering that there's always humans involved in processing. Right? It actually resonates quite well with what Ash has been talking about, in that a lot of the things that we do are about trying to make connections. I started this by doing my work on CocoaPods in order to make it easy for people to make decisions around what open source they would like to use, or how they should use it themselves, or use it for internal work. And so far, I've not seen a community with as many such tight coupling between tools and opinions. But I've only been involved in Ruby and Cocoa, so you can't take too much from that for granted. But my belief in open source by default is like an idea that we're moving towards not just caring about ourselves, but caring about a community. And I've always wondered in the past few months, like, what is the next step? Like, we now have every single line of code available for anybody else to read, see, and change. And I feel like if the step between actively contributing for our own use and then contributing to our community's use, I feel like the next step from that is trying to find like ways in which the works that we do on a day-to-day basis can affect the world. A lot of what I have been feeling lately is disillusioned with the state of mass surveillance. And this has no connection with CocoaPods or anything else like that, although we are now tracking all your installs. But like, I feel like as developers, we have these abilities that are almost magical. We can make effects that can do so much good, so much bad. We have the abilities to make changes that has not really existed before in so many different domains. Your knowledge in the iOS world is just as valuable if you went to start working in C++, or if you started to work in JavaScript. But the question is, for me, how can you use the knowledge that you are gaining as a programmer to start affecting world change? How can you use the skills that are rare to actively improve things for everyone? From my perspective, like the next step for open source by default is to start working on tooling around cryptography and making tooling to make it so that like it's easy for every app developer to start applying real security in their applications. Like, these are things that we have been happily skipping because to some extent Apple provide a lot of the underlying basis, but I'm pretty sure everybody will have probably done the allow whitelisting for all, application transport, right? Every time I've looked, I've not seen a single app that has actively turned it on. Everyone has just turned it off and probably made a memo. Do this sometime in the next few years. It's true. How can we try and move ourselves to a point where not only do we consider our users just because we consider them users of our applications, but that we consider them as humans. We consider them as people that actively care about their privacy. They care about the interactions that they have with multiple applications. And, you know, I as an individual did not get involved in the Ashley Madison hack, but the people that did must be heartbroken to have lost all that data. As iOS developers, we don't hold the data, but we have ways in which we can connect to it and we can work on actively improving the connection. And I want to build tools to start working on this. So don't get me wrong though, like there's no technical answer to the end of mass surveillance. It's a political problem. And like I as an individual have started working on some of the smaller applications that exist within the current App Store. Like there's the two tools that Edward Snowden uses on his iPhone, Chat Secure and Signal. And these are two, iMessage clones basically that allow you to do encrypted conversations between each other. The same is, I've been trying to encourage as many people as possible to use tools like Keybase, which is a way of sharing your GPG tools that are the way in which you should be encrypting mail between each other. These are like problems that developers know exist that we still haven't been attacking hard yet. And I feel like the next step towards taking open source by default a little bit further and starting thinking like, how can we improve things for everybody, is looking at these kind of problems. So from my perspective, the things that are important are like your impact. And the things that are not important are things like, what language did you use? You use Swift, Ruby Motion, React Native? Do you like object-oriented programming, functional, blah, blah, blah? These are all methodologies in which we can get things done. The things that we get done are the important part. And it's about trying to choose what parts we should be doing versus what things should we be arguing about. And I feel like the world is always needing improvement. And we actually have some useful powers in trying to make those changes. So from my perspective, the keys in which we can all make active changes towards this are: be nice to each other. Use the skills you have to make an impact. Get your feet wet in open source if you're not doing it yet. It's a great way to start actively improving the community you're in. You could help out on CocoaPods. I know, right? Hey, we're getting close to 1.0. It's looking like the next release. I know, right? Well, Justin said so it felt like it was time. Because of this, I wanted to celebrate with something. So this has not been finalized yet, but I have a big plan. It's going to be super exciting. CocoaPod socks. Yes, branding. I've been talking with like a Kickstarter for socks to start making 1.0 launch socks, which is like as exciting as I can that's all my energy going into this at the moment. So yeah, world impact. I think that the tools that we make allow us to make an impact in ways that previously we couldn't. And I feel like moving towards open source by default allows all of us to make impact on the world, more than just the apps that you are shipping, but on improving your community and improving the world eventually. Thank you. I could use that one again. Cool.
Any questions?
I have two questions. First question, do you see any changes of psychology of developers who start to develop open source and before? Like, do they have more happy or they have more motivation to write nice code or something like that? And the second, what do you think we need to say to our upper manager to convince them to be open source?
I fear the first one is relatively easy. Most people that I see in the active in the open source world get much better job offers, and as an individual, that alone is probably worth it, right? You as an individual have a much better worth because you can show all of this example stuff. I feel like you can't just jump to open source by default. You have to start saying, I'm gonna try ship this library as an open source thing, or I'm gonna one of the ways in which I tried to ship a part of our code base was actively through blog posts. So I had this idea about how you could write unit tests for migrations with core data, but none of the apps were open source. And so I just shipped a blog post that included all of the code. Right. And no one's going to vet you. You don't have to vet your manager probably on your blog posts. So processes like these allow you to work your way towards doing these kind of things without actively stating, I'm going to open source our app. You can start by just saying, well, we've got a library out there. Now we've got 2. Now we've got 3. Now we've got 4. Pretty much one of the pitches I made to the people above me was that like nearly all the source is already available. There's no difference of just shipping the app. But there is no guide to this. This is something that everyone individually has to find their own way, but that it is something that like you can actively do. It is not like impossible. You just have to have enough conviction that it is a valuable thing for you and your company. If you want the easiest metrics, like the amount of incoming job offer requests we get at Artsy dwarf some of the companies that you will have heard of, specifically and only because of this kind of policy. And that's really useful in terms of hiring and in terms of feeling really good that we're doing an okay job.
Thank you for the talk. I think that one of your points was that open source is a tool to improve your knowledge and your skills, both for the one that ships the open source code and the one that uses it.
Yeah.
If this is one of our points, right? And I perfectly agree. Actually, I think that the real value of open source is the one of knowledge, of learning. Okay, and I think that if someone uses something that doesn't understand just because it works, it becomes a victim of pop culture, fashion libraries and something. So what are your thoughts about this kind of process?
I think from Apple's perspective, it's pretty terrible. From my perspective, I think it's kind of cool because it means there's a large amount of people that are also doing the same thing as you. It means that you can get good support. You can very likely rely on other people to make improvements. And as an individual, you don't have to write so much code. There are, of course, downsides in the increased complexity, and it is the code you are shipping with your app, so it is included in your code, makes them all a hard call. Part of my last year in my open source work has been around trying to make it easy for people to understand the metrics of why you should choose to use a library or not. So on CocoaPods now, there's a list of all these different quality metrics that are like average lines of code per file, or has got unit tests, or has multiple contributors, has a large amount of GitHub stars. Like you can use all these things to then make your own decision, whereas previously you may have only just been able to see the README and look at some of the source code and then start looking at the amount of commits, the number of contributors, and trying to make it easier for people to make informed decisions about these kind of hard choices sometimes. Because you can, include a foundational library and that will be in your app for the rest of its lifetime if it's 320, right? I mean, I don't know how many people ditched the app 320, but I'd imagine, not the app, I imagine a lot of people decided to just outright rewrite instead of trying to, improve the app. And being able to make solid assertions about what you should be including is just a hard process.
Okay, I totally agree with your point of view about the good outcomes that you can have by open sourcing, even as a personal growth, as a developer, and for the community and everything. And often when I think about it, I end to a conclusion. You're advocating even a good behavior between people. It's not just about code. It's also about a community that behaves in a given way where everybody cooperates and there is no evil. This sometimes can be an utopia because, for instance, I work in a startup and we started alone, but some competitors are actually popping out.
Yep.
And sometimes these competitors can be way bigger than us, and it might become dangerous for us to become. I know that the team itself has some values, so you shouldn't be afraid too much, but it still can become, from an economical perspective and standpoint, dangerous, and not just for that. Sometimes you might make mistakes, you might expose your
keys,
vulnerability, not just the keys, but
that.
also, something that it's a weakness.
Yeah.
And this can become, I mean, dangerous even in a more business-centric
Yes.
point of view. So I just wanted to know, what do you think about it? Is this an utopia, or from your perspective, you might end up in a good situation if...
That's valuable. An app like Paper, the Paper one, not the Facebook one, that probably couldn't be open sourced. Its entire thing is the app. In our case, we can open source our application because it's about the databases, and it's about the Genome project. It's about the connections we have to galleries. I don't necessarily know what your app is, but your business is not always just the app. But there are definitely good cases when you shouldn't be open sourcing. And you don't have to open source from day one. You could get to a point where maybe you have won or maybe you have lost to your competitors. And like there is still a value in the code base and the process. But you might be past the point where it would make sense for someone else to try and bootstrap off your work. But yeah, it's my vision is a bit utopian, but hey, that's what you do as a speaker. I'm here to inspire.
We have time for one last question. So, thank you, Orta.
No problem. Ciao, ciao.